I had little intention of doing a Halloween episode this year due to time constraints from other things away from creating videos, and I also couldn't think of a traditional horror game that I would have played a lot of besides Forbidden Siren to cover. And while I did originally intend on doing a more traditional horror game, I was actually this close to covering Siren Blood Curse on PS3. I figured for this one, I focus on a game that, while isn't specifically a horror game as a whole, it's still classed as one due to its themes and gameplay, not to mention its level of violence. I am of course talking about one of Rockstar Games' more twisted installments, one that hasn't really been replicated since. Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of GB Reviews, my third Halloween special to date. On today's episode of GB Reviews, I am going to be delving into the one and only Manhunt. On a personal note, I used to own Manhunt on PlayStation 2 within the first 2 years of its release, but I sold it years down the line and I haven't reacquired a physical copy since. But I did manage to grab this stunning original PC copy, and while it has seen its fair share of use, it's these kinds of boxes, particularly for PC games, that I miss seeing. The version I'm going to be taking a look at is mostly going to be focused on the Steam version, and a few tweaks were made to make it run the best possible way on my computer, such as proper widescreen support and whatnot. So this is the version that most of the footage will be taken from, but there is really no gameplay differences that I noticed at all. I also want to put the following disclaimer before I go further into this review. Manhunt is a seriously violent video game, and the footage I will be using is mostly uncensored. Even though I've made this video not for kids, don't blame me if your child watches it or discovers it. You have been warned. Developed by Scottish developer Rockstar North and published by Rockstar Games, Manhunt was released in late 2003 for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox and eventually ported over to the PC in April of 2004. As we all know, Rockstar North are the same company that gave us the Grand Theft Auto franchise, going all the way back to the original game when they were known as DMA Design, becoming Rockstar North shortly after the release of Grand Theft Auto 3 in 2001. Manhunt began development almost 10 years prior to its release, eventually getting its first trailer in early 2003. This would be Rockstar North's first non-Grand Theft Auto game after releasing Grand Theft Auto 3 and Vice City in back-to-back years prior. Manhunt would also be Rockstar North's only non-Grand Theft Auto game going forward, as the sequel, Manhunt II, would be handed over to Rockstar London, and every game released by Rockstar North post-Manhunt would be a Grand Theft Auto title. So it was interesting to see Rockstar North tackle something that was a little different from what we were used to seeing. What we got was a more grounded take on survival horror, focusing more on stealth and violence rather than emphasising the survival aspect that we would have seen in the likes of Resident Evil and Silent Hill. It was also not without its fair share of controversy. Even away from Grand Theft Auto, Rockstar still managed to land itself into scrutiny from mainstream media due to the game's excessive levels of violence, but I'll get more into that later in the review. Until then, let's continue with the story and the plot of Manhunt. Please be aware, there may be some story spoilers, but there will almost definitely be some gameplay spoilers as well, so you have been warned. Manhunt takes place in Carcer City, following a criminal named James Earl Cash, an inmate on death row who was supposedly executed by means of a lethal injection.
James Earl Cash, found guilty and sentenced to death has been on death row for the past 3 years and was executed.
Shortly after, he awakens to find out he was only sedated and receives a call from an unknown entity who calls himself the Director.
Hey, tough guy, wake up. You're not dead. Well, not yet, anyway. You're getting a second chance. Another throw of the dice. As far as the world is concerned, you died back in the chamber. Justice was served. James Earl Cash.
He instructs Cash to escape from prison and kill various gang members around Carcer City. Essentially, Cash is being forced to participate in a number of snuff films filmed by the director. Doing this will earn Cash his freedom. A series of events occur throughout the game and it ends up snowballing from that point. Without getting into too many spoilers, I will say that things don't go as planned for the director, but it also doesn't go as planned for Cash as well. In fact, for Cash, things get much worse before they get better. Manhunt is regarded as a third-person survival horror action game, and the main tone of the game would be the aforementioned violence. And when I say that Manhunt is violent, I cannot stress that enough. It's not so much that you kill enemies, that's common in a lot of games. In fact, Grand Theft Auto and violence go hand in hand, so it's nothing new. But it's the manner in which you, the player, commits these acts of violence. The game starts off tame enough, giving you a couple of tutorials on how to play the game, showing you how to hide from enemies, how to sneak up on them. The first kill you're encouraged to do in Manhunt involves suffocating an enemy with a plastic bag. And if you thought that was bad, there are 3 different ways to execute the enemy with each weapon. The longer you hold the action button, the more violent the kill becomes. For example, a normal plastic bag execution involves a simple suffocation. If you hold the button a little longer, you can achieve the second level of execution, which is highlighted by the yellow cursor on the screen, which involves not only suffocating the victim, but also beating him up while you do it. The highest level of execution, which is highlighted red, involves not only suffocating him, not only beating him up while suffocating him, but suffocating him, beating him up, and then breaking his neck. And that's just with the first weapon in the game. That's just with the plastic bag. Although, I found the level of violence for each type of execution sometimes blurring the line. For example, I personally found machete kills more disturbing on the lower level of execution than either of the 2 higher ones, simply because the enemy sounds like he's getting into a state of panic before getting his head hacked off. It's actually the most disturbing, or at least one of the most disturbing kills in the game. Manhunt encourages the player to get creative with how they take enemies out. Sure, you could just get into a fist fight and kill them that way, but where's the fun in that? The game grades the player at the end of each stage, based on how fast they completed it, how many enemies they killed, how many they executed, and you also earn style points based on the difficulty you played on, with a final score at the end which is marked out of 5 stars. But you can only earn 5 stars if you play on the highest difficulty setting. Playing on normal, or fetish as the game calls it, will only allow you to earn up to 4 stars. So there are incentives to come back and replay levels on a higher difficulty should you want to improve your score, as getting high scores also unlocks cheat codes and different bonus items. The game takes audio into consideration as well, which is useful for distracting enemies. If you make noise, the radar will show how far the noise will travel. If you make noise near an enemy, he will make his way to the source of the noise, giving you a chance to strategize your kill. You can achieve this by punching a wall, running instead of walking, kicking over trash cans, and firing a gun if you have one. You can also throw specific items if you want an enemy to walk away from your vicinity, such as bricks, glass bottles, and yeah, even decapitated heads that you may have hacked off with a machete. And speaking of weapons, Manhunt allows the player to dispatch enemies using various different tools, from the aforementioned plastic bag to glass shards. You can also carry a meat cleaver, an axe, a machete. Yes, even a chainsaw makes an appearance in this game at some stage. Firearms include a revolver, a Glock, and even a sawn-off shotgun. Not to mention a nail gun, a sniper rifle, and an assault rifle. Yeah, there are plenty to use throughout your playthrough should you go in all out, which I do not recommend unless the game pretty much forces it on you, such as in one particular mission where you are introduced to gunfights. Doing a non-stealth run not only stops you from attaining a high score, but then again that's dependent on the kind of mission you're doing, but it is also clunky and not very well executed. All it turns into is a hacking contest where you just hope to be the one that kills enemies before he kills you. There is no strategy. That being said though, the gunplay can be satisfying at times, especially when popping an enemy's head off with a shotgun.
I can't keep this pace up all night.
That will always feel good no matter what game it is. Nevertheless, Manhunt still encourages you to do everything as stealthily as possible. I have another complaint regarding stealth as well. Running away from enemies is very inconsistent. Sometimes the enemy will lose sight of you after running a few yards, and there are other occasions where an enemy will chase you indefinitely with no sign of losing you. The game can't decide whether or not to make the enemy smart or stupid. I cannot tell if it's deliberate. But there was also plenty of dumb moments where I could be hiding in a dark area and an enemy would be right in front of me, like literally right in my face, but because I'm in the dark zone, he can't see me. It kind of makes it a little video gamey as a result. Sneaking up on enemies is a gamble as well. I suppose you could call this a good thing, but it just annoyed me when it went wrong. So I could be sneaking up behind an enemy, holding in the execution button, waiting on the goriest option I suppose. And then out of nowhere he just turns around. Just when I think I have the pattern down, the guy just surprises me.
Use some stealth, for God's sake.
There are also a few cases where enemies will just show up without warning, and there is little room for error. There was one time where I was making my way towards a building, and an enemy just appeared out the door and immediately saw me. There was no way for me to know this would happen first time. It was scripted. The second I set foot in a specific area, he would come out the door. I had to reload and do that thing where I hit the specific area, then immediately run back into cover. It's scripted nonsense like this that takes me out of it. While we're on the topic of sound and audio, I want to point out that Manhunt does this smart thing of cueing music to specific events that happen as you play, with the swell of music ramping up if you're being hunted and even louder once you're discovered. This makes the stealth, quiet aspects of the game that much more intense and anxiety inducing. I played this with a pair of modern headphones and I've got to say the audio has aged well in that regard. You can hear Cash's heartbeat when he's hiding, often increasing in frequency if he's running to an area or running away from enemies. And if you run out of stamina, you can hear his breathing becoming more laboured.
Real good, yeah. Back here, you dumb chicken shit bastard!
And it's not just the ambience or music that fits the game's tone, it's the voice acting as well. Aside from hearing the unsettling voice of the director in your ear, you can also hear enemies verbally interacting with each other, or on their own if they're bored enough.
Come on out, you bean-eating chicken shit! Hanging around. What's it doing?
And getting discovered by them somehow turns them angry. They see red when they spot you and they will charge at you, laughing, swearing, threatening you. It's actually quite terrifying.
You're at it again. Tease me,
Over there.
tease me, just like a teenage girl.
Run, doggy! Run, doggy! Zero in on this fucker!
There's something about this particular level of verbal abuse that comes uneasy in a game like this, and in my opinion it really does fit. I'd say the sound and voice acting are some of the best aspects about Manhunt, and you already know what I'm like when I have to critique audio. I absolutely suck at it, because I'm too stupid to pick it up or notice, but with this game, I really noticed, and I absolutely 100% believe that the audio is one of, if not the game's greatest strength. I want to talk about the graphics and the visuals in the game now. Manhunt uses the same rendering engine as that of Grand Theft Auto 3 and Grand Theft Auto Vice City, using the renderware engine, and the similarities in assets and graphical detail really show here. A lot of assets and textures are reused in this game, and I suppose that doesn't come as a surprise when a developer makes multiple games. It's quite common, and seeing as Manhunt and Grand Theft Auto allegedly share the same universe, it would make sense that it would almost look the same. Oh yeah, that's another detail that I forgot to mention. Manhunt apparently shares its universe with that of the GTA series, and the evidence comes from the fact that Carcer City is situated in the Liberty State, the same state where Liberty City is, which at the time would have been the Liberty City we would have seen in Grand Theft Auto 3. More evidence of this also comes from a Grand Theft Auto 3 news segment on the in-game radio show Lips 106, where the DJ mentions Carcer City and that the city is nearby.
So I'm sitting here reading the Liberty Tree, and it says, in nearby Carcer City, a good day for law and order as Police Chief Gary Shaver was cleared of corruption charges in a controversial decision by the court. Let's hope those missing witnesses turn up safe and
Seeing as
sound.
Grand Theft Auto 3 was released before Manhunt, it was clear that the developers had intended on having the games be from the same universe. Carcer City would be referenced numerous times throughout almost every mainline Grand Theft Auto game going forward. Now let's get back to talking about the graphics. I'm probably stretching here, but let me at least mention that the graphics of Manhunt are fine. For the most part, they're very 2001 to 2003. The tone reminds me more of Grand Theft Auto 3 than it does of Vice City, to be brutally honest. And of course, now that I've mentioned that it's set in the Liberty State, that makes perfect sense. It's dark, it's gritty, it's dirty, it's dreary. It also helps to maintain the atmosphere to enable the visual effects in the display settings, one of them including film grain or noise effects. I personally play with it turned off, though I have found myself switching it back on from time to time. It depends on what mood I'm in. It's more of a gimmick really, but it depends on how immersed you want to feel. The game is supposed to be set in a snuff film after all. Overall, the visuals are not that bad, but they're not cutting edge either. Not even for the time. Rockstar Games titles didn't really have the best graphics throughout most of the 6th generation. When you take Manhunt, GTA 3, Vice City, San Andreas and compare them to the likes of Final Fantasy X, Shadow of the Colossus, Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3, Rockstar titles weren't much in the looks department. But it didn't stop their games playing as well as they did, and personally I find Manhunt played very well in my books. Not the best, but very well. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, that is the controversy surrounding Manhunt. And I suppose it wouldn't be a Rockstar game without a little bit of the old classic controversy. But Manhunt was especially controversial, specifically due to the manner in which you execute enemies in the game. Here we go. The violence was so bad that even members of the development team were uncomfortable with the game releasing with the amount of violence it contained, with Jeff Williams, a former employee of Rockstar, stating, "I didn't support Manhunt's release. It may sound surprising, but there was also a mutiny at the company over that game. It was Rockstar North's pet project. Most of us at Rockstar Games wanted no part of it. We'd already weathered plenty of controversy over GTA 3 and Vice City. We were no strangers to it, but Manhunt felt different. With Grand Theft Auto, we always had the excuse that the gameplay was untethered. You never had to hurt anybody that wasn't a bad guy in one of the missions. You could play completely ethically if you wanted, and the game was parody anyway, so lighten up. Manhunt though just made us all feel icky. It was all about the violence, and it was realistic violence. We all knew there was no way we could explain away that game. There was no way to rationalise it. We were crossing a line. And then there's the obvious blame that the game was quote-unquote teaching kids to kill people. I hate this opinion so much because the game was rated 18 almost everywhere. You had to be 18 years old or over to buy it. This blame went so far that it was actually heavily linked to a real murder almost a year after the game's release. On July 28th, 2004, which is creepily enough my birthday, Stefan Pakira was murdered by his friend Warren LeBlanc in England. The game, Manhunt, was blamed for being the reason Pakira was murdered, claiming that the killer was inspired by the game to commit the murder. The victim's mother said that there were talks that he was obsessed by the game. Jack Thompson, who was a campaigner against violent video games, even said that it was inspiring copycat killers, and yeah, you know the drill with this guy. He basically links every atrocity that happens in the world directly to video games without much evidence or any evidence at all. He was hired by the victim's family in an attempt to take Sony Computer Entertainment and Rockstar Games to court over the murder of their son. In other words, they sued both companies in a wrongful death claim, essentially blaming the companies for his murder. The game was also taken from shelves in the UK as a result of this. I will never forget this report, as I saw it in an article in a video game magazine that I bought frequently. I'll also never forget the fact that the link between the game and the murder was denied by the authorities, and that the motive was none other than drugs, and that the game actually belonged to the victim, not the killer. As a result of this, the case was eventually dropped. Any publicity is good publicity, and as a result of Manhunt getting the attention it received due to the controversy, the game started selling more. The controversy did not hurt the game's sales numbers. Now, I just want to point out that I don't condone what happened. I don't believe that what happened was right. Of course it wasn't right, obviously. It's murder. Why would you? Why would you? I'm not trying to negate the seriousness of the crime, but I also don't like it when video games are automatically a scapegoat for bad things that happen in the world. I don't know why it's a target, maybe because it's more interactive than any other medium. Imagine this scenario with that in mind. Imagine the board game Cluedo. We all know what Cluedo is. It's a murder mystery, and you have to find out what weapon was used, where it was used, and who used the weapon. They're very creative in the scenarios that are in that board game. Can you hypothetically imagine a murder taking place that occurred in the exact same way as one of the possible scenarios in the board game Cluedo? Can you imagine that happening? If you asked any everyday, if you were to ask any normal person, they would probably turn around and tell you that that's ridiculous. Why? Because Cluedo is a board game that has been around for over 70 years and is a beloved board game for many, many families who love board games in general. It's very famous, it's very popular, the world knows what Cluedo is. Can you imagine taking Hasbro to court because someone copied the possible scenario in that board game in which they conducted a hypothetical killing? Can you imagine? It would never happen, because Cluedo is Cluedo, but because it's video games, and video games were initially aimed at kids, they've basically matured as they have the people that have played video games. We can do more with them, but there's a generation of people that still think that video games are just running from left to right, jumping on enemies and trying to attain a high score. You know, like fun old video games that were originally aimed for kids. There is a generation that fail to see the progress that video games have made over the years and still want to regard them as kids' toys, and therefore they use that in a way to suggest that violent video games teach kids how to do horrible things when they are actually aimed at adults. And it doesn't stop there.
Now to this video game so horrifying it has been banned in Great Britain. It is now set to be released here in the U.S. on Halloween. It is called Manhunt II, and we must warn you, there is nothing about this that is not disturbing. Manhunt II allows gamers to take on the role of a mental institution escapee.
Manhunt 2, the sequel to Manhunt, wasn't without its fair share of controversy either. In fact, it probably received more scrutiny than its predecessor. Jack Thompson once again swooped in to try and get the game banned, and 3 years later, after the murder incident, claimed that Take-Two, which is Rockstar's parent company, lied in their report about said incident, and that the copy of Manhunt did indeed belong to the murderer and not the victim. Again, this was 3 years later. The victim's family had also condemned the sequel's release, which is understandable if you believe that the game was linked to the murder, but in this case I do not believe it really was. So this was still unfair. They were still adamant that the first game played a role in the death of their son. Obviously this effort was unsuccessful. Jack Thompson was eventually disbarred from chasing video game violence and hasn't been seen in his beloved spotlight ever since. Thank Christ. But Manhunt 2 was not safe this time. Not as safe as Manhunt was, if you could even call it that. Just before Manhunt 2's release, the British Board of Film Classification actually rejected a rating for the game, alongside the Irish Film Classification Office. Rockstar didn't even fight it this time. Despite the fact they disagreed with the rejection, they went ahead and toned down the violence and ultimately censored the game in various different ways, from causing the screen to flash during an execution, to turning the screen red and removing decapitations, even removing weapons that could cause decapitations in the first place. There are many other methods of execution that I'm even too uncomfortable bringing up. So if you want to know what it was they actually did in order to censor the game, or if you want to know what the uncut version of the game contained, Google is your friend. I'm not uttering it. On release, despite the censorship, Manhunt 2 was still banned in various countries. To this day, the uncut, unedited version of Manhunt is scarcely available and remains banned in the UK and Ireland. The only way I've been able to see it is on torrent websites. That's the only way really you can get a hold of that game easy. It also comes across a little bit hypocritical as well when you consider the reasoning for Manhunt and Manhunt 2's banning. The reason is because of its extreme levels of violence, but then when you take a look at other games that have probably more levels of violence, why weren't they banned? Why wasn't this banned? This could have easily been banned in the UK because it has extreme levels of violence. But yet it maintained its popularity and it maintained its place on store shelves. Yet it was never banned. But it has more violence than Manhunt. And if you think, oh well, Mortal Kombat is a little bit out of date, it hasn't aged very well, the graphics are a little bit old, well that's okay. I have another game for you as well. What about these two? These have got cutting edge graphics, very realistic, and these are very violent. These were never banned. These were never removed from store shelves. They continue to sell. Why weren't these banned? I could go on. Why weren't these banned? Why weren't these banned? Why wasn't this banned for inciting riots? Why wasn't this banned for its levels of violence? And it doesn't stop at video games. If you're going to ban video games for being too violent, why don't you continue on with movies? Why wasn't this banned? Why wasn't this banned? Or this, or this, or this, or this, or this, or these. Why weren't they banned? Those have negative connotations set about them, and those weren't banned from shelves. Why were they still around? Why were they sold? If you're going to ban stuff for being violent, be consistent about it. Stop picking and choosing the things that get banned just because it grabs your attention quicker. But if you're going to ban violent video games, ban violent movies as well. Otherwise, stop it. Take-Two Interactive hasn't released any statement regarding the future of Manhunt, aside from its complete and utter denial that any more games will be created. In other words, Manhunt 3 may never happen so long as Take-Two own the IP. Manhunt never sold that well during its initial run. only selling 1.7 million copies in 5 years. Despite this, however, the game still received decent reviews from a few gaming journalists, with IGN giving the PS2 version an 8.5 out of 10 and Game Informer scoring the game a 9.25 out of 10. It currently holds a Metacritic score of 74 to 76 across all 3 platforms and has garnered a fairly loyal fanbase over the years. It was IGN's number 85 for top 100 PS2 games of 2010 and was also included in the first issue of 1001 video games you must play before you die, even going as far as to be listed one of Rockstar's very best games in a Vice article by Ed Smith from 2016. But it's not all sunshine and glitter. If you look deeper, you'll find that Manhunt actually has more of a divisive opinion than what the face value of critics state. It could be nostalgia goggles bringing them back, but in an issue of Play magazine from November 2003, they gave the game the equivalent of a 3 out of 10, 30%, stating, "Manhunt goes out of its way to annoy, forcing you to play the game its way. The violence lacks Tenchu's style, and the humour isn't humorous. We get game ideas like this all the time. They are sent in on torn school paper written by 7-year-olds. One came in a few years back, it was called Murderer, and as a piece of paper it was a better game." Oof, that's harsh. I also mentioned the game on a forum that I am frequently on, and a user responded to me saying, "I found Manhunt to be one of the worst games I ever played. It was so try-hard edgelord, and the gameplay was janky stealth, where you held down a button longer for gorier kills that were always disappointing because of how awful the game looked. I don't get the love for this game. If it wasn't Rockstar, I'd say it would have been forgotten about, and I remember Rockstar took the UK exclusive review from the magazine because they gave it a 3 out of 10. I'm assuming he means took down the UK exclusive review, and the 3 out of 10 is the very same magazine that I mentioned. Yeah, he's probably right. Maybe if Manhunt was developed by someone else, it wouldn't have garnered that much attention. Was it violent for the sake of being violent? Possibly. But let me play devil's advocate for just 1 minute. Did this need to be violent? Personally, I think it absolutely did need to be violent. Now let me explain why. Mortal Kombat without its gore isn't that good. The only reason Mortal Kombat sold well was its media attention surrounding its violence, not to mention being one of 2 major reasons a rating system was brought in for video games. Without the blood, Mortal Kombat would have just been another fighting game in a sea of so many better ones, and I'm looking at you, Street Fighter 2. So I'd say if Manhunt wasn't published by Rockstar, it may have been swept under the rug as just another mindlessly violent video game made to be edgy for the hell of it. But then you have people like me, who enjoy gory video games anyway. I love violence in video games. It doesn't make me a sadist or disturbed, because I like violent movies as well. And they're very popular. Look at almost any horror movie.
Morgan, what the fuck are you doing?
Did Manhunt need to be violent? I say it did, because if it didn't, it would be nothing more than a poor man's Hitman, with literally zero reason to be worthy of anyone's time. I think because it is as violent as it is, it gives us an option. There might be people out there who played Hitman and maybe thought, I wish there was a game out there that was like this, but much more violent. Basically, Hitman with gore with the visuals brought down a notch. Overall, Manhunt to me was an enjoyable experience. I hadn't beaten the game since I first played it about 15 years ago, so my recent playthrough has given me a new perspective. Do I recommend it today? It depends really. Despite me loving the game, I will admit there are plenty of games that do the Predator/Hunter style of stealth much better. Hitman would be one that comes to mind first, in that you have creative ways to take out your enemy. It's just that Hitman runs away with it tenfold, as it's just better built for that particular style. Manhunt is fun in my books, but it is very surface level when it comes to how it plays. It's ultimately incredibly linear. If you take away the executions, then this game would probably be terrible. In fact, I think the executions is what keeps its fans. I think it's what saves its reputation. Trying to play this game without the executions, without the stealth, is very janky and not that fun at all. It sort of reminds me of Fallout 3 and New Vegas, where if it wasn't for the VATS system, those games would not be as fun. Playing those games without the VAT system is a horrible experience. Nevertheless, I still think Manhunt, as it is pretty good, and I think it's aged okay. If you're still curious and want to play more of it, it's very easy to get a hold of. It's even available on PlayStation 4 now. You can find it on the PlayStation 2 section of that system's storefront for about €14. I think it's for $14.99. And it comes fully rendered in 1080p and has full trophy support too. And while I did grow up with it on PlayStation 2, my latest experience has been on PC, and it is surprisingly very well optimised, at least after a couple of tweaks. You can find it on Steam, that's where I bought it. With that being said, I think that I've mentioned everything that needs to be mentioned about Manhunt. I actually never intended on doing a Halloween episode until I rediscovered this game randomly while going through my stuff. And it's classed as a horror game, so I suppose that counts. And I think that's just about it for this review, so we have now come to the end of the video. Thanks for taking the time to watch this review. This has been Dave talking here on GB Gaming, where video games come first. Thanks again, stay safe and happy Halloween. Thanks, and goodbye.